When did you get here?
Last night. Yeah.
From?
From Newark.
Okay.
Yeah. But it was fine. I don't take the night flights.
You don't sleep on the flight?
You don't sleep well, and if you're going to get up and work, I've found.
Yeah.
I mean, I did when I was a foreign correspondent. I'd get on anything I could, but yeah. I mean, one of the things I want to talk about, and it's something you know more intimately than I do, but it's one of the things that is, aside from the fact that I'm a journalist who's published classified information, I mean, we have just as that, but one of the things that's disturbed me from the start is how all of the international bodies and the legal entities that have gone after Julian have broken their own rules.
Yes.
And it's so blatant. And that's what I find kind of incomprehensible, because it's public, it's not a secret. And then there's many secret stuff they've done too, of course. But, you know, revoking political asylum, allowing British police to go in on sovereign territory, charging him under the Espionage Act when he's not an American citizen, recording his meeting with his attorneys. I mean, any one of these things in a normal legal procedure would have seen the case dismissed. And yet they keep doing it and doing it. You know, I sat in London, I can't remember, it was with Baritza when I was here, and then covered it online. But it's in those details that the judicial farce is exposed. And it's not just one egregious violation, it's repeated violations, and aside, of course, from what they're doing to him personally. That, and the failure on the part of the public, and in particular the press, to react with a kind of outrage, because if they eviscerate the rule of law, it's not just going to be for Julian. You know, they set those kinds of precedents, and if they're allowed to get away with it with anyone, it's dangerous. That's what for me is just so frustrating.
But don't you think they're deliberately dismantling
yes.
the system?
Oh,
they
yes.
want to
of course.
show that they're dismantling
Yes,
it.
they are. But they're dismantling right in front of us, and we're just watching. And I mean, I'm talking about the broader public and not reacting. Yes, of course, that is the goal. And so, you know, we're in a way that passivity makes us complicit in what is ultimately our own enslavement. I mean, this is all, of course, even beyond Julian as a person and as a journalist. And that's what, you know, having followed this case for several years, and as you know, I was very close friends with Michael Ratner, which is how I met Julian, because I would come to London with Michael. I'm just kind of mystified at how people can't see where this is going to lead.
I think they're maybe afraid. I mean, I can't explain it otherwise, or maybe they don't really want to believe that it's happening. But
I think it's because they have demonized. So after 9/11, because I speak Arabic and spent 7 years in the Middle East, we demonized Muslims in the United States. I don't know how it was here, but you know, it was really awful, and there were all sorts of cases, like this case of Fayed Saad Hashmi. I don't know if you know that case. So so what happened after 9/11 is, and of course they were serving the interests of Israel, is they went after Muslim groups and individuals in the United States who were outspoken about Palestine. So the Holy Land Foundation, my good friend Sami El-Arian, wonderful man, but these were articulate, effective, and they charged them under terrorism laws. And again, with Sami, it was like Julian. It was a completely fabricated case. And of course, it was Crumberg. It was,
yes.
So in the Eastern District of Virginia. So I watched them do it. And with Hashmi, he had been a really charismatic Palestinian activist. I don't think he's Palestinian, I think he's Pakistani, but he was at Brooklyn College, and then I think he was at the London School of Economics or University of London or something, and they were just determined to get him. And his roommate had sent, you can't make this stuff up, waterproof socks, I didn't even know they existed, or something, to Pakistan to give to Al-Qaeda. I mean, we're not talking about AK-47s or anything. And had used his phone to, like, and so they nailed him on that. And they brought him back, and they held him in the MCC in New York for, I think it was 23 months in isolation. Wow. And by the time he got under SAMS, under Special Administrative Measures, so no communication. I mean, they had secret evidence that they used against him that even his lawyers weren't allowed to see. By the time he got into court, he was a zombie.
Right.
And so I watched that happen, and of course, I said, and that they are doing exactly what they're setting legal precedents by which they can strip us of any legal protection. And again, it was actually not just watched passively by the American public, but cheered on because they had demonized the Muslims. And I think they've done a pretty effective job of demonizing Julian. And that's how they always do it, because they will demonize a particular group, then strip all legal protections from that group.
Yeah.
And now, of course, you see, I don't know if you've been following Cop City in Atlanta, where the police are building this a kind of paramilitary compound with like shooting ranges and all sorts of stuff, helicopter landing pads. I mean, this is urban domestic warfare. And so there have been heavy protests in Atlanta, but they're charging all these people with the terrorism laws. Animal rights activists are getting charged now with the terrorism laws. Right. Eco activists are, so that's the playbook that they mount, as they did with Julian, a very vicious black propaganda campaign, and then they're allowed to create these mechanisms by which nobody has any rights at all. And by the time people wake up, it's too late. I mean, it's that famous Niels quote, "First they came for the Jews, but I wasn't a Jew." I mean, but it is, it's like that, I think.
Well, it also creates the mechanisms, as you said, like, and the energy that goes into creating, I don't know, a whole machinery behind going after the perceived threat.
Yes, well, that's right. It's fear. Yes, that's right.
And then once that one threat is overcome, then that has to go somewhere. And so it gets redirected to some other issue.
But although I think reading the CIA, which is a state within a state, it's not even accountable within the Congress. And there was a few years ago, Feinstein, after the torture was exposed, tried to do a congressional report. And there was this really revealing moment. I'm no fan of Feinstein, but she was at that moment trying to do the right thing. And she came out and she was just ashen. And I can't remember the exact words, but it's something like, we can't take on these people, because they had bugged all the computers in the congressional office. They destroyed information. And I think it was that moment where she personally realized that we can't control. There's no regulation, there's no oversight, there's no control. And unlike the Church and the Pike committees that in the middle 70s had exposed the crimes, that was it. That moment is gone. And I think that Vault 7, because of this kind of imperial attitude on the part of the CIA where they can do anything, because the CIA, we have 17 intelligence communities in the United States. I mean, the CIA as an intelligence organization is kind of redundant. Right. And what it has done is transformed itself into a paramilitary, especially after 9/11. So it's completely in the dark. I mean, it has its own drones and special forces units, and having had friends who served in Afghanistan and Iraq, these people create more problems than they solve, because they'll go in on extraction and night raids and anger an entire village, and then the next day the Rangers will go through the village and they open fire on it. So, I mean, they're counterproductive. And I think that what happened with Vault 7 is that you now have an incredibly powerful organization that is, in essence, a paramilitary organization with, huge resources. And that exposure of Vault 7, they're not used to being monitored, exposed in any way. I think the anger, it was more visceral. I think the anger within the CIA ran really deep. And, again, I haven't spoken to anyone in the CIA, but my guess is that at that point, they laid down the law. We're getting Julian. That's my guess. I think it's all been, because Biden, no matter who's in the office, Obama, you can't, at this point, they talk about the dark state. I mean, these are the figures like Biden are the puppets. In the military, the U.S. military has not been audited for a decade. I read somewhere we spend more on military bands than we do on the State Department. I mean, again, it's like ancient Rome. I mean, it's its own entity, almost severed from the government.
Right.
But that's how I read what happened after Vault 7.
When did you first meet Julian?
So I was very close friends with Michael Ratner, who we lost, sadly. We were really good friends for many years. And he, of course, after 2010 and the Iraqi war logs came to London and asked for a meeting with Julian. And according to Michael, they said, we think they're going to come for you. And Julian said, why? And he said, because that's how they work. And we think they're going to charge you under the Espionage Act.
Right, because until that point, there had been it was only this was 2010, right?
Yeah,
and
2010.
Obama came in, early 2009 he started?
Yeah, 2009.
And it was under the Obama administration that the Espionage Act started being used.
He used it flagrantly against whistleblowers. And we have to draw a distinction because Julian is the first journalist charged under the Espionage Act. So you had Daniel Ellsberg and these kinds of figures. But going back to 1917, the Espionage Act was primarily an instrument to destroy the left. So it was, they shut down the socialist publications under the Espionage Act, the masses, and I think appeal to reason. They put Debs in prison, the socialist candidate. I think he was actually in prison under the Sedition Act, which was kind of a twin act. They did the deportations of Emma Goldman, and it's always been an instrument that's been used to destroy the left. But it was, as I believe this is right, that between 1917 and the Obama administration, it was only used 3 times against whistleblowers, once against Ellsberg, and that case collapsed because they invaded his psychiatrist's office and all this kind of dirty tricks.
I think another case was afterwards pardoned. It was really
it was not
used.
It wasn't. And Obama's assault on civil liberties was worse than Bush, and he went after anyone who leaped, Kiriakou and all sorts of others. And that, of course, is the lifeblood of journalism. So we need people on the inside with a conscience who are willing to share information about malfeasance, crimes, lies that the government is committing. That's how we do our work. And because of wholesale surveillance, and that's why Snowden fled, they know immediately who's connecting with journalists.
Right.
And I've been visiting, and I visited and I write letters to Daniel Hale. This is just a really sad story. This young Air Force officer with incredible integrity and courage, and saw that in the drone attacks, it was up to 90% of the victims were civilians, including children. Yeah. And then he was sitting in these rooms where the drone operators had this jocular contempt, they knew they were killing children, and they were calling them pint-sized terrorists. And I mean, it was just sickening. And he exposed that, and he's now sitting in Marion, Illinois, in a high security, used to be the highest security prison in the country. Now we have ADX Florence, Colorado, but they have him in one of these management control units, which replicates. I mean, and it's in the middle of nowhere. So if I visit, I have to fly to St. Louis and drive 3 hours down to Illinois in literally these cornfields. I mean, because of course they don't want you to visit. So in order for us to do our work, we need people like Daniel Hale. And it was really Obama who shut down any of that connection. And I can't remember, it was either 9 or 11 times he used it. And so I still have friends at the New York Times who do investigative journalism, but they have told me repeatedly that there is no investigative journalism now within the government, with the inner workings of government, because everyone's too frightened to talk, because they can immediately be traced. So the last readout of any kind of exposure of the crimes, the criminal activity of power, comes through people who are like Chelsea Manning or Snowden, who have access to documents and will leak them, or hackers like Jeremy Hammond, who I sued Obama in 2012 over Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which he signed at midnight on the last day of 2011, hoping no one would notice, which overturned the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, which prohibits the government from using the military as a domestic police force. And in Section 1021, it actually said that people are allowed to be held without habeas corpus, without due process, until, quote unquote, the end of hostilities, which is just in a more, I mean, it's really a terrifying kind of almost Orwellian. Right. And I sued him in federal court. Nobody thought we would win, including Michael Ratner. And we just got this judge and we won. And then, of course, it was Obama. He freaked out. They freaked out. They had the NSA lawyers in her chambers an hour after the ruling, demanding, she issued a temporary injunction, which meant that if American citizens were being held in Guantanamo-like conditions anywhere in the black sites around the world, this was against the law. And, you know, I and the lawyers were kind of curious, or we wondered why did they respond with such alacrity? Well, because they were holding, probably Afghan, you know, dual national, Iraqi, whatever. She, to her credit, and she's no longer on the Southern District, she went back to private practice, she refused. So then they went to the appellate court. So in the American system, you have the federal court, then you have the appellate court, which is a panel of judges who review it, and then your last chance is the Supreme Court. So they went to the appellate court. That was a Friday. They went to the appellate court on Monday morning, and they lifted the injunction in the name of national security. Right. The problem with, and gets back to Julian, is the law was so black and white that this was such a clear violation. They didn't know how to rule. And so they didn't rule. They just waited and waited and waited months. And I had been one of the plaintiffs in Clapper versus Amnesty International, which did get to the Supreme Court, where journalists had challenged the government about surveillance, because we can't work, obviously. We can't, if we're being surveilled as well as people who are trying to reach out to us. And there was an incredible line, because this was before Snowden, where the government lawyers assured the court that if any journalist was being surveilled, we would tell them. Yeah, I mean, it was patently absurd, but the court bought it. And then, rather than hear the merit of the case, the appellate court said I didn't have standing. That's the way they always get rid of you. Right. I don't have a right to bring the case. They said Hedges did not have standing to bring in Clapper versus Amnesty International, therefore he doesn't have standing in Hedges versus Obama. And they threw it out. We filed a cert to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court didn't take it. So it's law. It's law. But, you know, having been involved in this kind of detail and having done the kind of work, albeit on a much smaller level as Julian did, and having watched all of this process, it has really been the death of investigative journalism. Now they will leak you. The other things about leaks, as you know, is that governments will leak all sorts of highly classified material that makes them look good. So it's not that you don't get leaks of highly classified, but it's selective leaks that they want out. And so now it's over. I mean, and that's really frightening. It means there's no power is in no way accountable. There's no transparency. And we know history has taught us that when that kind of secrecy is imposed on autocratic power, abuse grows upon abuse grows upon abuse. And that is why they're just determined to crucify Julian. That's the crisis that we're in. We've lost the ability to know what power is doing.
I have this feeling that in order to establish the baseline you would have to give a history lesson.
Yeah.
Because, for example, the use of the Espionage Act, you have to understand that it
Yeah.
wasn't used for almost 100
Yeah.
years.
Against whistleblowers and journalists.
Against whistleblowers and journalists. And that there was a shift with Obama
Yeah.
that opened the doors to maybe one day the Espionage Act being used against publishers in the same way that it was now being used against whistleblowers. And the way it was being used against whistleblowers was as if they were spies to begin with. So there was a progressive
Yes, that's right.
shift. And that's why Julian was surprised when Michael Ratner told him that he thought that the US would try to try him under the Espionage Act after he had published, because it was unprecedented, because, you know, the First Amendment is clear.
Yeah.
And the First Amendment is really a revolutionary instrument, and it is the gold standard in the world. And I think perhaps culturally we are used to there being this gold standard, and through American cultural projection, which is what I grew up with. I was born in the 80s, you know, very clearly the idea of I don't know, liberal democratic Western freedom is attached to this idea of freedom of expression, and a press that is courageous and brave and powerful, in the sense that it is able to expose power and so on. And then with what's been done to Julian, because it's been so protracted, we're in a completely different information and security environment, as in the powers of the security state are far greater and have eroded all these other rights that came. You know, I think you have on the one hand the U.S. Constitution, and then you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and these things that were a strong underpinning to Western democracies for a long time. And that's kind of how WikiLeaks was born out of this kind of environment. But then since the surveillance state has become so powerful, and you know, there's been an ability to control communication in such an aggressive and invisible manner in the 12 or the 13 years since WikiLeaks published this, we're in a completely different environment.
Yeah.
So people who knew the before, on the one hand, we have like an information gap with people who don't follow things so so in such detail, but also a knowledge, like a historical knowledge gap. So although we can see this progression, this rapid progression into like a totalitarian, not just authoritarian, but like really aggressively accelerating, I think, into a totalitarian environment. For many people who are, you know, just a bit younger than me, they don't see it.
Yeah.
Because they don't have that reference.
Well, and
point.
also because it's hidden. I mean, so, you know, you're never going to get it trying to do 4 minutes on CNN, which is all someone like me would get when I used to get on CNN. Well, when I worked for the New York Times, they don't, you know, I used to say the real motto of the New York Times is do not significantly alienate those on whom we depend for money and access. So as a reporter for the Times, if you wrote stories that harmed your access to the powerful, you were harmed professionally. Yeah.
So would that happen like before the article was published, or
no,
after,
you would write articles that would, you could alienate the powerful occasionally. Mm-hmm. But if you made a habit of it, the powerful would, I mean, I can give an example. Like, so after I covered the war in Yugoslavia, and then I covered the Dayton Peace Agreement. And so I was on the ground, and I fully understood that the Dayton Peace Agreement had just frozen the conflict. It was kind of, you know, it was the absence of war. It wasn't a peace agreement, because all of the killers and the warlords were still in control, terrorizing their own people in towns throughout Bosnia. And I started to write that. And Clinton was running, part of his re-election campaign was on how he brought peace to Bosnia. So Sandy Berger, who was the head of the National Security Council, they went after me big time. And the way they do it is they have lunch with the publisher and they start bad-mouthing you. And then the editors they see the editors and they get uncomfortable. So you become a kind of management problem if you... I think the only thing that saved me and allowed me to spend as long as I did with the Times is that I would put myself in really extreme situations like Sarajevo that nobody else wanted to. When I volunteered for Sarajevo, the executive editor said, well, I guess the line starts and ends with you, because by the time I got there, 45 journalists had been killed. And then I didn't have to interview officials because I was on the street. I mean, like when I covered the first Gulf War, I didn't go to press conferences with Schwarzkopf. I hardly interviewed anybody over the rank of sergeant. You know, I hung out with Lance Corporals. I was with the Marine Corps. And so that kind of saved me. But yeah, if you, and the other thing about it is that the closer geographically you get to the centers of power, so I was overseas, but if you're in Washington or New York, then the less tolerant they are about your confronting power. So that a journalist overseas that is trying to write a narrative, which is almost always in conflict with the official narrative, is not only at war with whatever administration is running the country, but their Washington bureau, that makes their journalism is contingent on them, you know, doing lunch. So you're battling, has always been true. You take the great reporters on Vietnam, they were battling the Washington bureau, their own bureau, as much as they were battling, you know, the people running the war. So, yeah, that's so an elite publication like the Times is very obsequious to power and will cater to power. And, you know, I don't know if I've told you, but I heard after the publication of the war logs, why did these papers like The Guardian, which has been awful, or The Times, why did they turn on Julian? I told you this story? I said, no, you don't understand. They hated Julian from the moment he released that. Because, the only reason they ran it is because if they didn't, they would have been exposed. He shamed them into doing their job. And they loathed him for that.
But that doesn't matter anymore, right?
It doesn't matter anymore?
Well, I think they don't mind being shamed. I think there's
You mean they don't have any shame?
They don't have any, well, yeah, they don't have any shame. Because, for example, take the Twitter files. It's perfectly...
Yeah, but the Twitter files were more nuanced and opaque, perhaps. I think even to this day, it would be pretty hard to ignore what Julian released. It was so cataclysmic, so huge, so important. And people forget, not just in terms of exposing U.S. lies and crimes, but around the world. I mean, Haiti was convulsed by those revelations, which there was traffic that showed how the U.S. Embassy was working with the Haitian government because there are all these sweatshops and to suppress the minimum wage. I mean, you know, stuff like that. You know, part of the quid pro quo, and let's talk about the CIA. The quid pro quo is that you will do the dirty work to destroy journalists who expose. So, like Gary Webb. I don't know if you know about Gary Webb. So Gary Webb, I think he was with the San Francisco Chronicle, one of those papers in California, and he exposed that whole. And I was in Central America at the time. That whole CIA relationship where they were supporting the Contras under the table and selling cocaine and actually shipping cocaine to the States, and flooding neighborhoods in Oakland and stuff with it. Well, Gary Webb was destroyed by the press because what happened was the CIA held briefings, and I know the reporter from the New York Times who went to the briefing, and discredited the reporting. And the Times never went, and a good reporter would go out and re-report it. You would go out, check the sources, go and try and find out follow the trail that Webb followed. That's a good reporter.
Right.
And that didn't happen. So the Washington Post, the LA, they all piled on Webb. And they didn't actually report. They went down there, they went down to Langley, they got a background briefing, and of course he killed himself. So it's a very, I mean, papers like the Times are, their relationship to power is, they consider themselves part of the elite power system, and they don't want to lose that perch. At the same time, they're trying to position themselves as adversarial journalists.
Right.
And it has, and probably less power now with the diffusion of media, but when I was overseas, I used to work overseas when I didn't work for the New York Times, so I'd have to call 30 times for somebody to call me back. You call once on the Times, they call you back.
Right.
And the funny part about it, I began as a freelancer and then eventually worked for the paper in Dallas, is that these Times reporters would come down and have all this access, and they thought it was them. It wasn't them, it was the institution. They weren't particularly good reporters necessarily. Right. I was good friends with Sidney Shanberg. I don't know if you ever saw The Killing Fields. That was the movie about Sidney and Death Prawn, who I also knew. But I remember Sidney saying to me once, and Sidney was pushed out of the Times because although he'd won the Pulitzer and came back, he saw how the developers were driving the working class and middle class out of Manhattan and destroying rent control, and he started writing about it, and all the rich friends of the publisher got angry,
right.
and the executive editor started calling him, Sidney, my little commie, and eventually was pushed out of the paper and worked for the Village Voice. But I thought Sidney gave me the best description of how the Times, or papers like the Times. He said, well, we may not make things better, but if we do our job to the best of our ability, we stop things from getting worse. And I think that's a good definition of the commercial press. And this gets back to Julian, because all of the great advances in journalism have come from the non-commercial press that has, going back to that, shamed, the way Julian did, shamed the traditional press into doing their job. So I write for ScheerPost. This is Bob Scheer's website, which he pretty much funds from his Social Security check. But, he's one of the legendary journalists. He was the editor of Ramparts magazine, which was the leftist magazine in the 60s. And he broke COINTELPRO. That iconic picture of the little girl in Vietnam running naked down the road, that was first in Ramparts. And if you look at the inception of the war in Vietnam, the coverage was all cheerleading. And it was publications like Ramparts, in the same way that we saw with Julian, that forced these people against their will. But Bob was, at the time of the Iraq War, a columnist at the LA Times. They fired him because of his opposition, and I also got pushed out of the Times for my opposition to the war. And so that's, Julian has done what, great journalists. I remember once working for the Times, some intern, probably went to Harvard or something, said, well, who do you think the best reporters in the country are? I said, well, I could tell you, but you would have never heard of them. He said, they don't work for us? I said, no, they don't work for you. They don't work for us. And so, this is, of course, why I admire Julian so much. That's what great journalism is. And I worked on the inside of the beast.
Right.
And with the limitations of that, and I was, finally willing to become a management problem and get pushed out. But I know how the system works, and that without figures like Julian, the system is morally bankrupt.
Well, it's very interesting what you just explained, because I think I kind of imagined it being a bit like this when the story broke about Mike Pompeo making plans, asking for the CIA to kind of outline how they would kidnap, rendition, or even kill Julian in the embassy. And the story broke in 2021. So this was after the initial extradition case and so on. And it was 3 national security reporters at Yahoo News investigations unit. And it was really detailed. And, you know, you look at these reporters and they have a track record of, you know, with sources inside the CIA and so on. And Pompeo's reaction to it was to effectively confirm it, because he then went out and said that the sources, and there were over 30 of them, should be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. And of course, you only get prosecuted under the Espionage Act if the information is authentic.
Right.
So, huge story, and you couldn't imagine a more interesting, newsworthy story than this one, right? Because a journalist inside an embassy with political asylum, CIA head planning, asking his staff to come up with sketches and options.
It was quite detailed. I mean, weren't they going to land on the roof or something? Or
yeah, there was huge detail, and then it didn't get re-reported. It wasn't, well, it did by The Guardian, actually. Eventually got re-reported by The Guardian. But the New York Times didn't touch it. The Washington Post didn't touch it. And I was actually, I brought it up on the BBC on a radio interview that was live. And the interviewer said, but the CIA has denied it. And I said, no, they haven't. They haven't denied it. They haven't commented, and Pompeo effectively, he just confirmed it. And then it was just like they were given this talking point that they had nothing to base it on, because I then, after the interview, I went back and I verified that the CIA had not denied it. The one time the New York Times did report this Pompeo murder plot was after the defense filed this story in the evidence in the extradition case. So that gave them an excuse to be able to report it. But before that, it was incredible. I mean, there was no mention of it, but they needed this court document in order to reference it. So this showed to me that they needed this excuse.
That's exactly
because it was
right.
clearly newsworthy.
Yeah, that's right. Well, they didn't really want to have to report it because they didn't want to they want to shutter their sources with the CIA. I mean, it's a very delicate dance that you play, and there are, reporters within institutions like the New York Times. All they do are fed, especially the Washington Bureau. They're just fed crap. Yeah. I mean, they don't actually report anything, and they're held in very high regard by the institution.
Right.
So when I covered, after 9/11, I covered Al-Qaeda. I was based in Paris. And French intelligence did not want the Americans to invade Iraq. So they had given me, at the highest levels, I had complete carte blanche at the counterterrorism office run by this crazy Corsican. But I could go in and just ask. I mean, I covered Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, and the Brits weren't giving me anything. They were awful. And I would just go, and he'd go, okay, get the files. And, I'm looking at pictures of Richard Reed walking out of the Brexit mosque and, all this kind of stuff. And the French knew that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. And the French, unlike the Americans, actually had human assets inside of Al-Qaeda. Well, the Americans didn't have any. It was all electronic eavesdropping, a lot of which they couldn't read, by the way. Yeah, it was interesting. So they knew chatter. They could pick up chatter, but they couldn't. As it was explained to me, they used to code it in pictures. I don't understand any of this stuff. We'll have to call Julian and ask him. But they would code the messages in pictures. But so they knew something was happening, but they couldn't read it, the Americans. And I would go back to New York. Now remember, the New York Times at the time was, a full partner in the lie that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass and all this kind of stuff. And so I had really good, actionable intelligence, and I was just dismissed. Oh, that's the French. That's what, No, literally, Louis Scooter Libby, who I actually, I went to prep school with him, that he told us, Dick Cheney told us, and they didn't, it was like their ears were full of wax.
Right.
So they went after Judy Miller, who was loathsome, but it was an institutional failing. They didn't want to hear it. And at a time of kind of national crisis, whether that's real or manufactured, the press always falls into line, traditionally. It goes all the way back to the Crimean War. Every press has done it. And that's the role the Times was playing. So even though I had better intelligence, it was dismissed in the name of racism because we were, we didn't eat French fries in America at the time. We ate freedom fries and stuff like this. I mean, it was so childish, and I just wanted to go back to Paris.
Well, part of the problem is that the U.S., I'd say the Anglo-American press, but mainly the U.S. press, drives the narrative for European press, at least. And so I was speaking to some European press, and I was telling them this story about Pompeo, having his whole CIA deployed to bring down Julian and WikiLeaks, and even planned to rendition, an extraordinary rendition from the UK. There was mention of black sites, and how the indictment had come after these plans, because they then confronted with this problem that, well, what if we kidnap him and then there's no indictment? So that came, that was the sequence. And this is the proof that this is a political, if you needed more evidence, but that this is a politically motivated prosecution. And the answer was, well, but the thing is, the New York Times hasn't reported it, the Washington Post and so on. And so their view from very mainstream newspapers was that, well, it may be true, but because the New York Times hasn't reported it, then we're not going to report it either.
It's worse than that. It's because the New York Times hasn't reported it, it didn't happen.
Right. So
when I worked for smaller papers, let's say I go back to the war in Salvador, when I was working for the Dallas Morning News, I would report stuff, pretty horrible stuff, and it made no impact because the Times had a horrible correspondent who never went out. She went to the embassy and got what she was fed and published it, which is not only criminal in and of itself, but it hurts real journalists because even my editors would say, well, that's not what the Times is reporting. And I don't know that the Times still has that kind of power. I know that when I worked for the Times, our power was, as you said, that we set the agenda. So for instance, I would write a story, and then all the big networks, CBS, ABC, NBC, the producers, who are the ones with the brains, would come find me and say, well, what are you publishing tomorrow? Where did you go? Because their editors would read it in the morning paper and then tell them to go do it. That's how it worked. So the circulation of the Times when I was there, 800,000, 1 million, although you also have the wire service, which gets picked up. So papers around the country would be running my stories. But the real power was that it set the agenda. And so you're right, that if it wasn't in the Times, in a way, it could be ignored, or, as I said, it didn't happen. And I felt that on the other end. It was very frustrating. And so, there were even moments when we gave stuff to New York Times, inept New York Times reporters, because we were sick of not having any kind of an impact. You kind of would have to hold their hand.
So who sets the agenda now?
The press has changed since, during my career, because at the time, the New York Times, like the big networks, would try and reach a wide audience. Now they don't make an effort. The press has become completely siloed. So they cater to a particular demographic, whether that's Fox News, and you can see it in terms of the percentages of Republicans who watch Fox News of 94%, the percentage of Democrats, the figures may be slightly off, who watch MSNBC are 90-something percent. I think it's 87% of the Democrats read the New York Times. Because the model of the press has changed, where you're feeding your readers or your viewers what they want, there's no price anymore for stuff that turns out to be a lie. And in that way, as bad as the old model was, this new model's worse. Because accompanied with this feeding of your demographic what they want, you're demonizing the competing demographic. So the right media is demonizing liberals, liberals are demonizing the deplorables, and that gets to what I saw in Yugoslavia. So you had the same thing in Yugoslavia when it broke up. You had ethnic entities, Serbs, Muslims, Croats, and they seized their own media outlets. The first people they persecute is not the opposing demographic, who in some ways they need in order to build their, but people within their own demographic who are actually still trying to report the truth. Those are the most dangerous, and they will destroy them first.
Right.
And that's what's happening. What's happening in the United States is, and I don't know about the UK, but it's similar to that breakdown of Yugoslavia, because neither side is rooted anymore in verifiable fact. I mean, at least in the old days, the Times was rooted in selected verifiable fact, and I will concede that the lie of omission is still a lie. Now it's not even rooted in verifiable fact.
Right.
And I was walking through Montgomery, Alabama with Brian Stevenson, the great civil rights attorney. Half of Montgomery's black. And Brian's showing me all the Confederate memorials that have been put up. And then he says, most of these were put up in the last 10 years. And I said, that's exactly what happened in Yugoslavia. With the economic collapse and breakdown of Yugoslavia, and that sense of disempowerment, dethronement, and people retreated into these mythic identities, in particular kind of the white supremacy, white nationalism that's gripped the states. And that's what happened in Yugoslavia. But these are identities rooted in myth. They're not rooted in truth.
Right.
And I think we're very far down that road. And the consequences of it are potentially, especially since the United States is awash in automatic weapons, is really frightening. Whether that we already have, so many mass shootings, it's not news. And it's mass shootings of like kids in schools. And I mean, it's just, the kind of nihilistic violence. And then, as the great sociologist Durkheim writes in his book on suicide, people who seek the annihilation of others are driven by desires for self-annihilation. So these killers go in, and it's either suicide by cop or they shoot themselves.
Right.
And that exposes a very dark pathology within the United States, which the press is now contributing to.
Yes, I mean, if they took mass shootings, preventing mass shootings seriously, and not just as there's a political debate about arms control, of course, but then there's the fact the way the media plays those mass shootings that seem to be...
It's like climate change. It's disconnected. It's always a one event that has no connection to anything else,
Right.
So there's no water in Arizona. Well, isn't that an interesting story? And now Madonna is, so that's part of this disconnectedness,
Yeah.
And you spoke earlier about history, there's no context. And if you don't have any context, it doesn't matter what you report, you can't understand it. And that's what's been completely erased from the media landscape, any context.